What if giving birth wasn't a celebration of life, but a weapon of war? In the twisted machinery of Nazi ideology, motherhood was hijacked by the state. Behind the polished uniforms and propaganda parades lurked the horrific truth of the Lebensborn program. Secret breeding farms where selected women were used to manufacture a future for the so-called Aryan master race. These weren't just maternity homes, they were human assembly lines engineered by Heinrich Himmler and the SS, obsessed with racial purity. Chosen women were impregnated by elite SS officers. Babies were judged, sorted, and sometimes stolen. If a child didn't meet Nazi standards, or was born to the wrong mother, its life was expendable. This isn't historical fiction, it's a documented nightmare. A terrifying glimpse into the depths of eugenics, control, and cruelty. If you think you've heard the worst of the Nazis, you haven't. And this, truly, is not for the weak. The roots of the Nazi breeding programs lie deep in the twisted soil of eugenics, a movement that sought to engineer humanity by eliminating undesirable traits and promoting racially superior bloodlines. While eugenics had gained popularity globally in the early 20th century, the Nazis turned it into a state religion. Adolf Hitler's regime embraced these ideas with terrifying enthusiasm. Central to their belief was the concept of Volksgemeinschaft, a racially unified national community. To build this, they needed to control not just laws or borders, but genetics itself. Enter Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, who in 1935 launched the Lebensborn program. At first glance, Lebensborn appeared to be a benevolent welfare initiative for single mothers. In reality, it was a clandestine system to breed Aryan children, indoctrinate them, and erase impure bloodlines. The SS selected women based on their racial characteristics and often arranged their impregnation by SS officers. Himmler's goal was clear: flood the Reich with racially ideal offspring. Simultaneously, policies of forced sterilization, euthanasia, and child abduction complemented the breeding agenda. The Nazi obsession with racial engineering wasn't an undercurrent, it was central to their vision of a new world order. To execute their vision of a genetically purified Reich, the Nazis didn't rely solely on ideology, they built institutions. Lebensborn homes, established by the SS starting in 1936, were discreet yet state-of-the-art maternity facilities where racially pure mothers were encouraged or persuaded to give birth under Nazi oversight. At their peak, there were at least 20 such homes across Germany, Austria, Norway, and occupied territories. The women admitted were often unmarried but met strict Aryan criteria: blonde hair, blue eyes, perfect health. Some volunteered. Others were pressured. Some were impregnated by SS officers in orchestrated arrangements. In more disturbing cases, coerced or manipulated into participation. Inside these homes, women received better medical care and nutrition than most German citizens, because their children were considered assets of the Reich. Upon birth, infants were inspected for racial perfection. If approved, they were either returned to their mothers under SS guidance or given to elite Nazi families for adoption and indoctrination. But the euphemism maternity home masks the truth. These were breeding facilities, part of a cold, clinical effort to multiply Aryan bloodlines while erasing identities. Women were valued not as individuals but as vessels. Children were commodities in a racial empire's twisted factory line. Even in their comfort and cleanliness, these homes were engines of dehumanization. The Lebensborn program may have begun with state-sponsored births, but it quickly evolved into something far more insidious and expansive. Estimates suggest that between 7,000 and 8,000 children were born in Lebensborn homes in Germany alone, with thousands more in Nazi-occupied countries, especially Norway, where the SS saw an abundance of ideal Nordic traits. But the dark truth doesn't end with births. As the Nazi war machine expanded, so did their hunger for Aryan-looking children, regardless of origin. Thousands of children were forcibly taken from families in Poland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, and elsewhere. The SS would assess them for racial value. If deemed suitable, they were renamed, re-educated, and placed with German families. Their original identities were erased, their pasts buried. This wasn't adoption. It was ethnic kidnapping, state-sponsored child theft on a massive scale. Many of these children never knew they were stolen until decades later, if at all. Those who were deemed unfit faced institutionalization, brutal treatment, or death. Nazi officials kept meticulous records, testimonies, evaluations, bloodline charts, like farmers tracking livestock. Meanwhile, propaganda painted Lebensborn as a humanitarian effort. In reality, it was human trafficking wrapped in racial science. The program blurred the lines between mother and state, birth and design, family and fascism. This wasn't just a project. It was a machinery of erasure. If Lebensborn was the Nazi ideal of racial engineering, its evil twin was the brutal reality imposed on foreign mothers, especially Eastern European forced laborers. These women, often teenagers, were brought to Germany under coercion to work in factories and farms. When they became pregnant, usually through rape or exploitation, they were shuttled to secret birthing facilities known as Ausländerkinderpflegestätte. Unlike Lebensborn homes, these centers were decrepit, underfunded, and horrifyingly neglected. The Nazi state had no interest in these infants except to ensure they didn't burden the system. Many of the babies born in these facilities were allowed to die from starvation, disease, or deliberate medical neglect. Historians estimate that mortality rates ranged from 50% to 90% depending on location and resources. Some centers didn't even bother with pretense. In baby camps across occupied territories, infants were given sedatives to keep them quiet or left to waste away in makeshift cribs. Mothers had no say. Once they gave birth, they were often separated from their children permanently. The racist logic was clear. If the child wasn't Aryan, it wasn't worth saving. These centers reveal the full spectrum of Nazi biopolitics. On one side, prized Aryan babies born in comfort. On the other, discarded lives, deemed unworthy of care. It was genocide through neglect, a quieter, less visible form of murder. And yet, this shadowed half of Nazi breeding policy is often forgotten. But it too is part of the darkest truth. The legacy of the Nazi breeding programs did not end with the collapse of the Third Reich. It lingered, silently, painfully, in the lives of those born into it. Many Lebensborn children grew up never knowing the truth of their origins. Raised by Nazi families or in orphanages, they struggled with fractured identities, buried pasts, and societal shame. Some only learned as adults that their entire childhood had been constructed on lies. For survivors, the psychological toll has been immense. Questions of belonging, guilt, and betrayal haunt those who were chosen. Meanwhile, survivors of the shadow side programs, children of forced laborers or stolen from occupied lands, often endured both the trauma of loss and the stigma of being born under Nazi control. The ethical implications remain staggering. These programs blurred the lines between public policy and personal life, between science and atrocity. They showcased how ideology can weaponize even the most intimate aspects of humanity: love, family, childbirth. Today, some countries have begun to offer recognition, counseling, and archives for survivors. But many still suffer in silence, caught between shame and forgotten history. This chapter of the Nazi regime reveals not just cruelty, but how cruelty can be systematized, disguised, and inherited. The Lebensborn program wasn't just a footnote in Nazi history. It was a core expression of the regime's obsession with racial domination. Through pristine maternity homes, forced adoptions, child abductions, and deadly neglect of undesirable infants, the Nazis turned childbirth into statecraft and mothers into instruments of ideology. What makes this story so haunting is not just the brutality, but the cold precision, the bureaucracy, the planning, The sense of normalcy imposed on such unnatural horrors. Today, it challenges us to examine how power can seep into the most private corners of life, wombs, families, and childhoods. It's a grim reminder that the pursuit of purity often begins with dehumanization. And while the uniforms and flags are gone, the questions remain. How did a nation convince itself this was just? And how many lives were lost in the name of birth? History remembers the tanks. We must also remember the cribs. The Nazi breeding farms represent one of the most disturbing chapters in human history, not just for their cruelty, but for how they twisted life itself into a weapon. Under the sterile surfaces of the Lebensborn homes and the shadows of foreign labor camps, a regime systematically molded who was allowed to be born, who was allowed to live, and who was condemned to disappear. This wasn't merely a war crime. It was a war on humanity, on identity, motherhood, and the sanctity of life. Even decades later, the survivors carry invisible scars, and entire generations remain haunted by stolen origins. We often ask how genocide can happen, but perhaps the darker question is how many looked away, reassured by comfort, by uniforms, by the illusion of order. If something so monstrous can wear the mask of normalcy, how can we be certain we'd recognize it again?